Hi, this is Inge coming to you from Denmark. Welcome back. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope you will enjoy the next hour talking about knitting, a bit of crocheting. Today I brought 3 finished items besides the one I'm wearing, the Flowerbud Tee in the second edition of my design. I have brought a vest made for my daughter and a sweater, a man sweater for my son. The vest is like this, longer in the back, and the sweater is tailor-made to a tall body and an apple shape. So you will hear more about how I did this and recalculated and the tips and tricks to fit it to your man. And then I have ideas for new cast-ons to show you. A bit of an update on my crochet blanket, and I continue the 2 new sections I started in the last episode. So one being knitting math hack, and today we will cover how to tailor make a pattern you've seen. Have you ever tried, you wanted to use another yarn that is called for in the pattern, and what to do, how to recalculate when both the stitch count and the row count is different. I have some of my ideas and tricks to do it. And the other section is knitting fun facts, and today we will cover the knitting history. I was a bit intrigued to find out who invented knitting, or where does knitting come from, and how does the first piece look like, and so on. But more about that later. Let's get started. Let's start with my own design, the Flowerbud Tee, which I'm wearing. And I will talk a bit about the modifications I made to the first test run of the design, which was this one you saw in another episode. So you can go back if you want to learn more about my ideas and in my head and how the design evolved. This time I will talk about the differences and the modifications and where I'm going now with the pattern. So I'll take a bit forward. So compared to the other one, the start is kind of the same. And then I made this leaf, the bud, the flower bud here, and the small leaf is also the same. But then I thought, well, in the first one, I had these big holes, and it kind of gives another impression. And I wanted it to be a little less lacy. So that's why instead of doing all the increases in one point, I did some of it here, took another row, and then yet another increase here, so that it kind of, gets it more rounded and not this lacy. And then the idea behind the slip stitch here was to make the stem of the leaf. And I thought, well, I will try to continue with this stem. So we have the slip stitch in between here. And I didn't do that in the first one. Another modification is how I do these increases here. Because in the first edition, I did increases and decreases, and then made one increase in order to account for the same stitch count beside, you can see here. And this time I have made it like cross stitches, so that while doing the decreases or increases, I have it's not my technique. I use the technique of doing the increases behind the cross stitch, so that I think it looks a bit nicer. So this is kind of different, and one change that's due to my size. The first one, I made the yoke a bit too deep, so that, you know, the problem when you raise your arms and your your sweater or your tee rises with you. This was not what I wanted, so I made it a bit smaller than the first one, or a little less deep. Yes, and I talked about the challenges on how to draft the chart of the pattern, and I figured out how to use stitch fiddle, and actually found some of these stitches I didn't know before is Estonian stitches, and they were found in this stitch fiddle. Another one is not there, but yeah, I kind of figured out how to do it anyway. So in my pattern there will be a graph or a diagram, because I'm very much a visual person myself, so I like to get the overview of a picture and yeah, the outline of how this is done, and then I can dig into the details afterwards. Every person is different on how to approach a project at work or knitting or whatever, but so I think in a pattern it's a good idea to accommodate every way of doing this, both details and the overview of a picture or a diagram. Yeah, so now I'm drafting the pattern and grading it for more sizes. This is a 2XL, and I will make a range of sizes, and I'm so happy to tell you that one has already signed up to do a smaller size. And yeah, this is my first time experience, so I was so happy and amazed that someone would like to actually knit up my design before I've done an official call for test knitter, so to speak. So yeah, happy camper, that's me. Yeah, I think this was all I had to tell you about this design. There, if you want to hear more, there's much more in my previous video. I'm so happy to show you this sweater I made for my son. It's been on my needle since February last year, so almost 1.5 years of anniversary now. But now it's done. I had some issues getting the right tension of the yarn. It was uneven, and I thought, well, I'd stop until I fixed my finger issues, and I did, and I could take up the project again, and now it's final. So first, the timeline of events, because a bit different than usual, because I asked my son, yeah, do you want a sweater? I would love to make one for you. And he said, yes, I would like one. And then we went to the yarn store for him to pick out his favorite yarn. And it was this one, Sunday by Sandnes Garn. It's 100% merino with a stitch count of 28 per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So it's fairly fine gauge, requiring a needle size 3 millimeter and 2.5 for the neckband or ribbing. So we estimated the number of skeins or balls to use for a sweater for him, and went back home with the yarn. And then we agreed that I would send him pictures on different kinds of sweater designs, so he could pick one he would like. So that's what we did. And he chose one from Hanne Larsen design, a Danish designer, and she's made this bottom-up compound raglan. Simple in design, with her small signature with this ridge, pearl ridge, separating the arm and the ribbing. Also here on the neckline and on the bottom part. However, I forgot and I found out further up here, and I didn't want to rip back, so that's how it is. But this time I wanted to make him a really fitted sweater for his body type. So I did all his measurements and looked at the pattern and realized that I had to recalculate all of it, because the pattern calls for Isager yarn, also a Danish brand, and it is the spinny version combined with Alpacka 1, so requiring a bigger gauge than this yarn. So I had a small task there of planning before I could start the project. And then I wanted, of course, to account for his measurements, and he is a fairly tall man compared to the rest of the family. So I had to make it longer. That's the easy thing of it. And then he has a small apple-sized shape on the stomach. So I wanted to account for a bit more fabric on the front side compared to the back side. It's just like when you do breast size for women with a bigger size breast. So instead, I just wanted them further down where you need it. So I made short rows down here to account for more fabric. So that's what I did. And yeah. I think besides her signature here, I think this raglan is different than I've seen in many designs. It kind of looks like in my childhood from knitwear from a knitting machine. It's two decreases on each side of a pearl raglan stitch. So yeah, quite nice. Yes, so I did the recalculations, and of course when both your row gauge and your stitch gauge and your row gauge is very different from the pattern, you have to take this into account when figuring out on which row should you do the increases and how many to fit the width of the sleeve and the length. And also here maybe a bit more tricky on the compound raglan, because you do at a certain row count here and a smaller row count here when you do the curve to kind of simulate a saddle shoulder. I think it's very nice boat-like design. And then the ribbing is a folded rib. So I cast off and sewed it on, but you can also knit it on, of course, but I found it a bit more time consuming, so I chose the other method. Yeah, other stuff about this sweater? No, I think maybe to add, usually I'm not that concerned with a slight uneven stitch tension, because usually wool is so forgiving. When you wash and block it, the wool blooms and you cannot see it. And this is also the case for this one. Perhaps I had a severe case of unevenness, so it was hard for the yarn to forgive all my unevenness, but I think it worked out quite well, and I'm content with the result. And I sent pictures of the sweater for my son this morning, and he returned heart smileys back. So I cannot wait for him to try on the sweater and see if I did all the calculations right to make a tailor-made sweater for him. So now for the knitting math hack section. How and what do you do when your yarn doesn't fit the gauge of your pattern? First of all, I would say if it's a minor difference, you go up a needle size or go down a needle size depending on the difference. But in this case, it was a huge difference. And I will show beside me my board that I will try to explain from. So when I'm looking down now, I'm looking at the board I've written, but you can see it beside me. So the pattern gauge was 23 stitches and 32 rows. However, my yarn and my knitting was 29 stitches and 43 rows. So this was quite a difference. So the first thing I do when I have a difference, I count the correction factor. And you can see here beside me, I do the correction factor both stitch-wise and row-wise. So the first, for the stitch-wise, I take the 29 stitches for my count, and then the 23 stitches for the pattern count, and then it gave me 1.26 in correction factor. So that means if if the yarn calls for 10 stitches, I need to multiply by 1 times 26, giving me 12 stitches instead of 10. This was just an example. And I do the same kind of correction factor for the rows. So when my row count is 43 and the pattern row gauge is 23, I take 43 divided by 23 and it gives me 1.34. So this is the basics, the correction factors. And then you can see I've drawn an example of the sleeve. So first we have the pattern sleeve and then we have my sleeve. And the pattern sleeve, I'm looking down again on my board here in front of me. So the pattern sleeve, it said you should end up having 94 stitches. And it's important to have that in mind. I count the end stitches for my sleeve would be 180 stitches. So when you do the checking of your math, that's what you want to go back to. But anyway, then it says you do the ribbing, 7.5 centimeters, and then you do every 7th row 4 times. You do an increase of 1 stitch on each side of the underarm here. And then you move on to every 8th row 10 times with an increase on each side of the underarm here. So you start out with 54 stitches and end out with 94 stitches. So it's easy to count when you then do the calculations of my stitch count. You just add the correction factor of 1.26. So I would start out with 70 stitches for the ribbing and end up with 118 stitches. So far, so good. And then we have to look at the length of the sleeve, because her pattern increases and at a certain point she stops increasing and then just knit straight forward here. And if you want to take into account a longer sleeve, mine being I guess 51 centimeters instead of 49, you can either make this longer or have longer spacing between your increases here. Yes, so far so good. Then we have the number of stitches you cast on for the armpit, and she has 10 stitches, so I use the correction factor and get 12 stitches. So I guess this was the easy part of it, but please look at the drawing, because we have to recount when she do the increases, how long is this piece, because this would fit a nice and smooth increase of the sleeve. So she has 25 centimeters up here for the upper part and 8.75 centimeters for the lower part, and then the ribbing part. So now we can move on to the next section, and this where you have to in Danish we say have tongue lige mund, have the tongue right in the middle of the center of your face, because there are a lot of numbers. So I give you one example. So when she says that she wants to increase for every 7th row 4 times, and she increases by 2 stitches 4 times, that gives me 28 rows. And this accounts for 88.75 centimeters. I calculated by taking the 28 rows divided by the 32 stitches she has per 10 centimeters in her stitch count. So when I have to recalculate this to my yarn, I take my row gauge, which is 43 rows per 10 centimeters, and then I take the length here, 8.75 centimeters. And this gives me 38 rows instead of her 28 rows. So 10 more rows I have to use for this. So now I have how many rows I need. So now I need to know on which row do I then do the increases. and how many stitches, and how many times, I mean. So she increases by 8 stitches on this piece, and then I do the correction factor of 1.26 for my stitch count. So I need 10 more stitches instead of her 8 stitches. So 10 stitches and 2 stitches increase per row gives me 5 increases. 5 times I need to do this. So I now take my 38 rows divided by the 5 times I need to do the increases, which gives me that I need to do increases for every 8th row 5 times. This gives me 40 rows and not the 38 rows that I had in the first calculation. But I think, yes, this is okay. This is okay. And then I have to do the same calculation for the 8th row, but I guess you can see it here, the math, but I guess you got the idea now. So that's what I did. And I tried it myself on the way. We are not exactly the same size, but kind of here on the upper part. So, and when I tried it, I looked, what? And I thought, well, have I calculated wrong? Because it was too long here. It was simply too long. He's a bit longer than me, so I could have done the armpit sooner here. But, what happened? And then I thought, well, my gauge must have changed because it has been sitting on my needles for 1.5 years. And that's exactly what happened. So I did a new gauge count, and my row gauge had reduced from 43 to 40 rows. So meaning that I needed less rows to do. So I had to do all the recalculations again. Instead of 43 rows, 40 rows. And I did ribbing back here. I lost 3 days. And yeah, but I would rather do the ribbing back and have a sweater that he likes and uses instead of having one which would look weird. No, it's a waste of good yarn and good time. So these 3 extra days were well spent. Yes, I hope this made sense to you, was not too complicated or long or whatever. I hope you can use it. So lessons learned from me with this project is, first of all, try to pick the pattern before the yarn. That would be one thing. The other thing, if it sits on your needles for a long time, check your gauge once over before starting up again. Yeah, because otherwise you may have to rip back. And do the math or the calculations 2 times. Do the checking when you have figured out at which row here and how many increases and so on. Do the rechecking to see if you land on or you end on the stitch count up here. If there's too much of a difference from the stitch count that you saw on the first, I will re-enter the picture, when I said that instead of her 94 stitches, I needed 118, and when you do the checking recalculation, you end far from that one. You've made a mistake somewhere. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. But if you have a son or somebody wanting a specific yarn and you love a design, then of course it is possible to do the recalculation. You just have to add more time for the planning phase than when using the yarn or similar yarn that is called for. And now for the finished object for my daughter, a vest or pullover, what you call it, with ruffles down here, and it's longer in the back. It's a design by Augustins. It's called Augustins number 4, and actually this pattern calls for a huge gauge. Was it 12 millimeter needles? and I made this on 4mm needles because maybe it's typically us. She picked this yarn she wanted, and it's another stitch count, of course, and we also wanted it to be less woolly, more summer-like, so it's half cotton, half wool, lamb's wool, and also take into account that if you have a big breast, at least on my body and my daughter's body, if you have a very bulky yarn, you seem even bigger. So we wanted it to make it in a smaller gauge. So again, I had to do a lot of recalculation of this pattern, but it's made from top down, and you start actually with 2 squares, and then you do increases out here to do the armpit, and you collect the stitches to do it in a round, and you cast off, and then you pick up the stitches to do the ruffles. And I thought, well, I could just continue and do the ruffles and do increases, but I chose to do as the pattern described because I thought, well, this would give a more sturdy ridge, or the look of it would be different. And then there are I-cords around here. And I did what I talked about in my last video, to do reductions before I did the I-cord in order for it not to curl up on me. So that's what I did. And I also did another modification because the pattern is straight up here, and I thought, well, I would feel like strangled. So I did a bit of a increased neckline, not much. And then I thought, well, and my daughter said, I don't want it that deep as you can see on the picture for the pattern. It would be too deep for me, even though I want to wear a shirt, a white shirt, or a shirt underneath, and then take this on top. So I did the increases sooner than called for in the pattern. However, when she wore it or tried it on, it was still very deep. So I said to her, well, I can rip it all back and start once over, and you know, start the increases here. I had done down to here. She, don't worry, Mom, it's okay, don't bother. And I said, maybe I can do some fixing somehow. I can try it out and you can look if you like it. And it is visible, of course. You can see here through the light. It's not that visible when you wear it, but I picked up the stitches here, and then I just added in, and yeah, a piece here for the armhole. And she said, yeah, I'm not usually doing like this, so people won't see it. And yeah, if she had said just one peep that I should rip back, I would have done it, because yeah, it's not my style. But anyway, it's fine. And this is made in hose yarn called Coast, so it's half around half lamb's wool and half cotton. So it's nice for the summer. And again, this hose yarn, both the super soft and the Coast, for me, it's lengthwise 11%, so I took that into account also. And when doing so, we need to account for it both before the increases here and afterwards in order to get the correct length, and then add the ruffles. So it's also like the sweater for my son, tailor-made to her body. She has yeah, she's not so tall, just like me, a small person lengthwise, and then she has this hour shape. So I also did some, what's it called, waist shaping, that's the word. Yeah, so she likes it very much, and she has worn it more times already. But again, I would recommend, yeah, of course it's depending on your taste, but and I guess when the pattern calls for a bulky yarn, which is more perhaps going down on here on the neck. I don't know if I explained this very well in English, but I feel like strangle width is too much. So should I do this again, I will do even more longer, a bit more down here. But it's okay, you can see the tip of the white shirt here. Yes. That was the last finished items, 3 ones this time for this video. So now we are moving onwards to the whips or new cast-ons. I showed you samples last time from samples of this yarn I wanted from Civic Fiesta yarn. It's yeah, I call it knitted yarn, and then the eyelashes with this poking out. And I wanted to do a bead throw or a summer top, and I did different things, and I different tryouts, and I now have decided to knit it from this side to this side. So I do a double a cast on, provisional cast on, and save the stitches, go around here, pick up and sew together here with, I guess, with Kitchener stitch, and just with a drop sleeve or short sleeve here. So it will be very easy to knit. And then I found out that, also inspired by my you saw the Flowerbud Tee. So I do these, I will do drop stitches and then have them go in this direction. So instead of having more garter stitches between the drop stitches, I do these Estonian stitches and then drop the stitch, make a section of, can you even see it? So it will be like this. I did a lot of things, but I think this is the one. And then I will turn it like this, as I said. So now I can, it will be an easy calculation, and just, I could also knit 2 pieces and then sew together here and the shoulders. So either way will be fine. So the only thing about this project is which yarn to choose, because I showed you the gray one, but I also have a light blue one, and I have a browny beige one. I like all 3 of them. It's more like I don't have an even count of balls for everyone, so I have most of the gray, so I could start there, see how much yarn it takes. But I actually would like this one on. Yeah, I will decide. It's not a big problem. Enough about that whip. I have more considerations for one of my whips. I showed you also the last time this dress for my niece of with this silky alpaca yarn from Sandness also. So I've been thinking, you can see the unevenness, but I will start over and rip this one back. But then I thought, well, in order for me to make the yarn more forgiving, could be to pair it with another yarn. Of course, it gives another structure, but I have actually 2 examples. This is the original Sandness yarn. Then I have this, it's called Curry Yellow, and it's vest design. It's called, I guess it's, yeah, it's very fine, you can see. And I have an example knitted up here. in 123 mm needle is one thread, and it's 100% merino. So I could pair this one up, but as you can see, it's not exactly the same color. So how would it end up? I haven't made a gauge watch yet, but would it be mild or would it just even out? I don't know. So this is kind of a bit more douce than this one. Or I could pick a mohair, a silk mohair. But this will definitely have another look with a fuzzy look, and I don't know if my niece likes it. So I'm still in the consideration stage. However, just like this one, it's been a long time as a web project, so I would like to somehow get this finalized, but let's see what I decide to do. I have more whips on my needles, but the last one I would like to show you today is my crochet project. It's the in-between in the car kind of project. And you can see here when we went to the beach, I did one, and my grandson, he said, "Well, can I try it out, Grandma?" "Yes, sure, you can." And then he took one of these and the hook, and I guess he mimicked what I'm doing, because of course he cannot crochet, he's 2.5 years, but he did like this, so mimicked what I'm doing. It looks so fun. You can see on the picture beside me. Oh, I love him so much. And we are going in a summer beach house right now in a couple of hours, and we've had the joy to lend him by the parents, so we can bring him for a couple of days. Hey, we love it, Granddad and I. Okay, but back to the project. Now you can see a picture beside me with how I have laid it out. So one decision I've made, and it is to do it in diagonal, but I don't know how to put them together yet, color-wise, that is. So I have laid it out on my dining table in our living room, so every time I pass by I move it a bit around and see what fits me, and then I just have to take a picture before taking it apart in order for me to crochet these pieces together. So I need to end up with a piece of what's it called, 60 centimeters times 120 centimeters to be a baby blanket, and the baby is due in 4 weeks, so I think I will manage. I think I will actually manage. As you can see, we've had a change of scenery. I didn't manage to get all the video done before we had to go to this beach house, so here we are a couple of days later. It is a great place, this summer beach house. We usually take our grandson, who's 2.5 years, with us on vacations, and he's used to being without his mom and dad for a couple of days or a week. Maybe it's because we live in a family collective, so he's used to seeing us almost every day, and we take care of him more days a week. So yeah, we just love these vacations. So now we are a couple of days later with beach hair and all. We have just returned from the beach, and our grandson of 2.5 years is having his midday nap. So hopefully everything will turn out so that I can finalize the video. I've tried to find a place in the shade, but let's see if I end up getting roasted and have to move. And I'll also try to speak louder than the birds. They are having a feast here. So let's move on to the program. We missed out just on the section of knitting fun facts, being knitting history. I've looked at many sources to find information about knitting. There's definitely a lot of information out there, but it's not necessarily going in the same direction. But I'll try to sum up what I've pieced together. First, I looked into ancient civilization to see if there were any signs of knitting, but no signs in the Greek and Egyptian ancient civilizations. However, you could find signs of spinning and weaving. So we have to move on in history to after the birth of Christ. Historians seem to agree that knitting was spread by nomads in the Middle East, so it spread by the Mediterranean trade routes, first to Europe and later on to Americas. The first example of a knitted piece is dated from around the 11th centuries and are these Coptic socks you can see beside me. These are stranded colorwork socks, and you might wonder, could they really be the first pieces ever of knitwear? Because we feel that stranded colorwork would be harder to make than unicolor work. And this is probably true because the materials were made of, or the knitwear were made of the materials cotton, silk and wool, and these are easily degradable and hence hard to preserve. We move on to the 14th century, where knitting guilds were established. They were very popular all over Europe, but the most fashionable ones, also back then, were in France, in Paris. And knitting was a man craft, so these master knitters of the guilds, they were consisting of men. And in order to become a master knitter and accepted by the guild, you had to be trained for 6 years. So the first 3 years you were in apprenticeship by the master knitter, and the following 3 years you had to travel to learn more about stitches and patterns of other countries. And once you came back, you had to do an exam piece, no, not just one piece, more pieces. For 13 weeks you should knit. And you can see an example here beside me of a carpet knitted as an exam piece. So I think that 13 weeks to do more pieces, including a carpet, wow. Either they knitted very, very fast, or they knitted for a long time every day. Around the same time as all these knitting guilds were established, we saw examples of knitting first in Spain, in Italy and in Germany, and these can be verified by the paintings found of Virgin Mary or Madonna sitting with the baby Jesus beside her, and she has knitwear in her lap. And this picture you can see here, it is actually knitted in a round. She has 4 needles. So early on it evolved from being 2 needles to more needles. Moving on to the 15th century, we see that the term knitting is seen in the Oxford Unabridged English Dictionary, and they explain knitting as the word coming from the word knot. And we know that knitting is actually loops, so why the word knot? This has led historians to believe that knitting actually evolved out of knoll binding, needle binding. And when we try to look back in history to find something about needle binding, this is actually dated far, far back to 4,000 years before Christ. So this is very ancient, and a very well preserved piece of needle binding is seen here beside me, being socks found in Syria in around 200, they are dated to around 250 after birth of Christ. They look funny with those toes, don't they? But I learned that they needed these toes in the socks because they wore sandals. Moving on to the 16th century, long stockings were very high fashion among men in Europe. You can see a picture here of one example, and it's also around that time we see pearl stitches for the first time, and also very simple lace being just a yarn over. In 1589, the mechanical knitting machine was invented by William Lee, and from that one and onwards from that time, knitting changes from being an art form, a handcraft for men, to being actually a parlor occupation by ladies in their nice living rooms. And knitwear becomes more spread to all people when you can automate the process. In this period, we also hear about knitters being employed to knit for the Catholic Church. And we have a piece here which is nice red gloves with golden threads, and it was also a very fine gauge, being only 20 stitches and 23 rows per 1 inch. So in the 18th century, we learn about the nightshirts in Nordic countries, but I will save more info about these nightshirts to a Scandinavian episode, because they are close at heart and there are many symbols and stories to tell about it. From the 19th century and onwards, I guess that knitting as a handcraft died out a bit. In 2007, Ravelry was established, and it definitely was a turning point to be able to have this forum meeting around the internet all over the world, so knitters could see each other's pieces and craft and designs and discuss yarn and projects. And certainly in the present times during the COVID pandemic, many people took out craft forms again and also knitted handwork. We were stuck in our homes during lockdown periods, and fortunately knitting was a very nice way of spending time and joy with the creativity. This was a very quick history tour. We have now reached the end of the video. I hope you liked it. Perhaps you got some inspiration for your own work. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel. You can also find me now on Instagram. I'm a fairly new user, but I try to load up pictures of my work regularly now. And soon I will also be on Ravelry, where I will enter the pattern for this design once it's finalized. So hope to see you back soon again in my next video or at the other social media. So Raja and over from Ingesknittinglab. Color me happy. Bye bye.